everybody moved one seat forward. That's one row, one seat, just one. I'm not trying to get everybody right up front, just one forward from where you are. This is going to be more like a small group lesson than a formal sermon. This is based upon a passage out of Luke 14. The first verse just sets the scene for us, and then the passage I'm concerned about is verses 7 through 14. So on one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. And when Jesus noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor, in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host, and the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, give this person your place, and then in disgrace you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher, and then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And he said also to the one who had invited him, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return, and then you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. This is the word of the Lord. I was going to say, where should we put this, Andrew? But it's broken. So I want to look at this little story that Jesus tells and ask what it means. And I want us to ask ourselves, what's our place at the table? Or what's our place in the world? Or what's our place among our fellow human beings? So this story Jesus tells starts out fairly plain and straightforward. Don't grab for the high place. It might not belong to you. And that's a lesson he also tries to teach James and John. James and John, his disciples. You might remember that once upon a time, James and John came to him and they said, Lord, we want you to give us something. We're going to ask you for it. And Jesus says, well, what's that? He says, when you come into your kingdom, we want to sit at your right hand and at your left hand. Those are where the most powerful servants sat, because you'd say, okay, go take care of this, and he'd do this and that. And Jesus said, right. Are you guys able to drink the cup that I'm going to drink? That is, are you able to pay the price that I'm going to pay to come into my kingdom? And they said, sure, of course we are, not knowing what the price was. And Jesus said, well, I got to tell you, the places at my right and my left hand are not mine to grant. They belong to someone else that God has already chosen from them. And you can't have them. They were trying to claim the places of honor, and it didn't belong to them. So here Jesus is telling this story in response to the behavior of a bunch of Pharisees. This Pharisee has invited friends and other respected people to come to his house for a dinner party. And the dinner party is, this isn't common anymore, so you're not used to the idea, but it used to be, up until maybe 100 years ago, at dinner parties, there was a rather strict stratification. The host and the most important guests sat up at the head of the table, and guests were scattered down the table by rank, especially in English society, and sort of in American society even at first. And more important people sat closer to the front, and less important people sat further down. It really was quite common up until 100 years ago or so. We've gotten very loose and casual about dinner parties now, but it really was like this. And he was watching people negotiating their place. I used to hear stories about this would happen at English dinner parties. Let's see, he's an earl, and I'm a count, so I sit below him, but I'm ahead of the knights. I mean, people would actually do that. I've seen it in novels and other discussions. So he was watching them all, trying to choose their places, and that's how he came up with this warning. Don't be eager to take the place of honor. It might not belong to you. And don't take it for granted that you're better than someone else. You might not be, or you might not realize who they are and how important they are. And I always worry that Jesus tells this story, so everybody listens to it and says, oh, now I know what to do. Whenever I go to a dinner party, I'll look for the lowest place. And you'd end up the reverse now. You'd have all the people who are proud of themselves going for the lowest place now, so that they'd be told to go up higher. Now you've got the same thing, but inverted. So what good does it do to tell a story like this? And I think that one of the things I wanted to teach out of this is that we have to be careful how we read the Bible. Because right at the beginning of this passage it said, Jesus told a parable in order to tell them something about what they were doing. A parable is a story with a point. And you have to be careful in the parables that you don't overinterpret the details. Jesus is not giving literal advice, saying, hey, when you go to a party, always go to the bottom first. If he did, everybody who took the advice would be headed for the bottom. And the very thing he's worried about wouldn't work. He's telling a story to try to catch people. Right now, at this party, everybody's been trying to get up high. So right now, at this party, the story's designed to catch those people who tried to get up high. And it doesn't have universal application. It's not a rule of behavior. It's a parable. It's a story. And we know that we shouldn't overinterpret the small details in Jesus' parables. He told one parable about 10 girls who were waiting for the bridegroom to arrive for a wedding. You're going to a lot of weddings. And they had lamps, because in those days, you know, if the wedding was at night, you had to have everybody who could bring a lamp or bring candles in order to light the room up. And half of them were smart. They had an extra bottle of oil, and half of them weren't, and they didn't. And in the end, the bridegroom comes, and the ones who didn't have an extra bottle are stuck because they can't make light anymore. And they ask the wise ones, here, share some of your oil. And the wise ones say, no, we might run out too. And don't let them have any. And if this were really advice Jesus was giving, we'd say, wait a minute. Don't help someone who asks you for help? Leave them out in the dark? That doesn't sound like Christian behavior, especially since in another place Jesus says, loan to the one who asks of you, and without expecting in return. But it's a parable. And the point is to be ready, even though you don't know when the bridegroom will arrive. And the business of the ones who had been ready, telling the ones who weren't ready that they wouldn't share with them, was not to advise people not to share, but to make the point about the advantages and the importance of being ready. In another parable, he told a story about a steward. A steward is a servant who's like your comptroller or your manager who runs things. And the rich man told his steward, he said, all right, I want an accounting. I've hired an accountant. He's coming in next week. We're going to audit the books. And the steward said, boy, I'm in trouble now. He wouldn't ask for an audit if he wasn't going to fire me. You know, so what am I going to do? So he went through the books and he called in the people who owed his master money. And he said, look, according to this, you owe my master 100 barrels of oil. We're going to change the bill to 50. And he did that with 3 different people. Changed their bills so it looked like they owed less. He was cheating, okay? He was lying, cheating, and stealing. But in the parable, Jesus praised him. He said, look, here this guy has done what he has to prepare for a disaster, being fired. He says, and this guy, a worldly person, a liar, a cheater, and a thief, is smarter about how to get ready for a disaster, for the end of everything, than the good people are. And what Jesus means is, look, I'm here now, and John the Baptist is here warning you that God is coming and it's going to be the end of everything, and you aren't paying attention or getting ready. But this guy is getting ready for trouble, and you aren't. But Jesus is not advising people to lie, cheat, and steal. When reading parables, stories that Jesus tells, you have to look for what the point is and not overinterpret the details. And it's the same way with our story this morning. The point is that seeking those high places is wrong because you don't know whether you're entitled to them, is wrong because you're trying to make yourself better than other people. Indeed, it's also wrong because the whole business of having high and low places at the table is nonsense. I mean, who made it a high place? I mean, there's a table over there. Which is the high end of it? It's just a table. It's legs and a tabletop. This is why King Arthur, you remember King Arthur, the Knights of the Round Table? This is why he had a round table. So the knights wouldn't be able to say, I'm in the high spot next to the king. They'd all be equal. It didn't work. Everyone knew that Lancelot was the best knight, and Tristram was the next best knight, and so on. But the table itself doesn't have a high and a low place. It's only people who give it that meaning. And giving it that meaning is already a mistake. It means trying to value people more and less than one another. And Jesus nails this home when he finishes the parable, the story about going to the head of the table, and now he turns to the guy who invited him. I mean, and remember, Jesus was invited even though he was one of the working poor, because he was the show. I mean, here this guy's invited all his Pharisee friends. Most of the Pharisees were what we would call middle class. Jesus was from among the working poor. But Jesus was a big show. He was this public preacher. People were going to see him. He'd gotten this incredible reputation as a healer. You know, let's bring him in to our dinner party and see what he'll do. Let's see if he does anything crazy or says anything wild. But the party itself was for people just like him. And Jesus says to him now, he's not telling a parable anymore. Now he's giving advice directly. He says, look, when you give a dinner party, don't invite your friends and your relatives and rich people who are just like you, because they'll invite you back and all of you will just sit in a circle together and tell one another how wonderful you are. When you give a dinner party, he says, go out and invite the poor and the hungry and the widows and the orphans and the lame and the blind. Because then you're doing something for somebody with no hope of getting something back for yourself. The whole point of the combination of the parable and of the advice Jesus gives to the landowner is, look, this whole idea that some people are better than others is a load of crap. This whole idea that some places are higher and others are lower is nonsense. This whole separation between people, the good people like us and the foolish people out there who aren't as good as us, that's all wrong. That's all wrong. Now, most of us have been in church most of our lives and have heard stuff like this most of our lives, so we tell ourselves, I don't do that. I'm not like that. I don't look down on other people. But we do. We do. We do it carefully. We do it unconsciously. We're probably not aware of it. Sometimes we do it to people we're doing charity for. We give someone a ride to some place they have to go and then take them to the grocery store and buy groceries from them. We don't give them cash. That's not smart. But we might take them to the grocery store and buy groceries for them and then take them and drop them off at their mother's house. And we say to ourselves, I'm taking care of this person, I'm helping them, but we're also looking down on them. Why do they need my help? Why aren't they taking care of themselves? Why have they let this happen to them? I know I have to struggle with looking down on my daughter because I'm not satisfied with some of the choices she's making these days. And I think she should make better choices, and because she's not making better choices, I'm just automatically saying, I'm making better choices and she's not. She's not as good as she should be. We do it. We really do. We just do it mostly unconsciously, mostly hide it from ourselves, or we think that we're just being accurate. I'm just being careful to be accurate. They really haven't gotten as good a job as they could get. They didn't go to school, and they can't support themselves. It's all right, they're not lower people than me, they've just done lousy. We tell ourselves that we're just evaluating what the situation really is, but we're not putting ourselves higher than them. But we are. The lesson here is that the differences between us are not differences about who's good and who's not, are not differences about who's more honorable and who's not. They're just differences in the kind of people we are, and the kind of circumstances we live in, and the kind of fortune we've had. We've been pretty lucky. We've been pretty lucky to have good educations, good opportunities, to live in a country where being poor would count as upper middle class in 2/3 of the rest of the world. But these are not the differences that make any difference at all. And Jesus is trying to communicate that. Amen.